Welcome to the INFOWARS Nightly News. I'm David Knight. It's Thursday, June 11th, 2015. Here are our top stories.
Tonight, politicians want to pass the trade deal to see what's in it. Then, the truth about geoengineering. And the polite police of Bilderberg perform a midnight raid on a journalist. That's next on the INFOWARS Nightly News.
And tell them Hell Cobra.
No, I'm not going to say Hell. Hell Cobra.
Our first story tonight, I think, is a perfect illustration of the interaction between the TPP and the Bilderberg elite, but you can see it already in operation here in the American government. And that's a story about Obama cracking down on airplane emissions at the same time he's buying a massive new Air Force One. Now, this is a Breitbart story. They point out that the EPA will now hold hearings on the prospective findings and then write up legislation. No, I'm sorry, they said regulation, didn't they? What's the difference? Well, the difference is you never voted for the director of the EPA. You didn't vote for the FCC commissioner or the FDA commissioner or the IRS commissioner, did you? Nevertheless, these agencies persist eternally without ever being elected by us, and they are the ones who are writing the law. That's what will happen if the transatlantic and trans-Pacific partnerships come through. Now, they go on to say these regulations will reportedly align with regulations that the International Civil Aviation Organization, an agency of the UN, is developing. You see how that trickles down? It's created by the United Nations. Then it's enforced by not even our legislature. It's enforced by a bureaucracy. Now, Senator Sessions has already pointed out that if this is passed in these trade agreements, in the TPP and the TTIP, the transatlantic, the trans-Pacific agreements, in those agreements are commissions that are essentially transnational governing units. This is going to be a political union as well as an economic union, and these will be living agreements. They will be modified continuously without any input from the legislature, just as we see happening here with regulations from the EPA as they assert authority over all water and tell us that we can't have fires in our fireplaces. They're going to crack down on barbecue pits. This is what's going to happen with these massive trade agreements if they go through. Now they go on to talk about what's really happening on the flip side of this, because see, as they're shutting down everything for you and I, they will give themselves exemptions for these things that are supposedly so evil. They, on the other hand, will engage in them, and not only engage in them, but indulge in them. Look at this description of this plane, the new Air Force One. This is a $367 million Boeing 747-8. It runs 4,786 square feet inside of it. That's bigger than most of your homes. They call it a palace in the sky, according to Business Insider. It's the longest airliner ever. The interior is glossy and gorgeous. They say it has leather couches, big screen televisions, top-of-the-line side tables, a stateroom that would make the MGM Grand envious, a huge office, a conference room, 2 galleys capable of feeding 100 people, and it burns 5 gallons of jet fuel for every mile flown. That's 21 pounds of carbon dioxide emissions per gallon. Now, that is what they will do. They will indulge in all these things that they tell us are so harmful that they have to be cut down for us, because you understand that when they enact these regulations for domestic airplanes here in the United States, it's going to be even more expensive to fly within the United States. Of course, I don't know why any of us would choose to do that unless we have to do it for business because of what they've done with the security state. Nevertheless, it highlights what is going on between the elites and the set of rules that they follow and the rules that they will impose on the rest of us to impoverish us, to control us. Now, the Europeans are not having any of this. Nigel Farage and the UKIP party in Parliament, European Parliament yesterday brought the TTIP to a halt. In this article from The Independent, they say Nigel Farage marches to the front of the Parliament in a protest against a last-minute vote to suspend debate on a controversial free trade agreement. That is the TTIP, the Transatlantic Partnership. They say that Stephen Wolf, UKIP's Immigration and Financial Affairs spokesman, initiated the protest by reading out rules of procedure stating that if 40 MEPs, members of the European Parliament, stood up, they could halt the entire plenary session.
Please stand up. Stand up. Mr. Chairman.
Non è possibile. La seduta era stata sospesa, ma non...
I had already suspended the sitting. It's not possible because we don't have anything on the agenda. The session is suspended.
Now, as you can see in that footage, the chair of the parliament said, no, you can't halt it. I've already closed it. There's no business to discuss. And Nigel Farage, as you also saw, went up to the front and had a heated discussion. I can only imagine what happened there because, we've seen the footage of Nigel Farage confronting the former European Parliament President, Herman Van Rompuy, saying that he had the demeanor of a low-grade bank clerk. Well, somebody with the demeanor of a low-level bagman, John Boehner, is not only not opposing this unconstitutional power grab, he is trying to expedite it. He's saying that it looks like we're going to have the vote tomorrow, on Friday, perhaps that early. They'll probably do it on the weekend, just as the Senate passed it through on the weekend. They always do the dirty work when it's a weekend, a holiday weekend, or when nobody is paying attention. From Politico, they say the GOP is bullish on the trade vote. And the interesting thing about this article is that in the last day, they have changed the subtitle. The subtitle now says the vote to grant Obama fast-track authority to negotiate a massive trade deal will be extremely tight on all accounts. That's not what they had a couple of days ago. A couple of days ago, when this first went up, they were talking about how the snag to keep this from happening was negotiations on welfare benefits for the people who were going to lose their jobs. That's still in the article, but it is not the subtitle. But that is the real subtitle as to what's going on. And of course, what's happening in this country is the same kind of parliamentary shenanigans that you just saw happen in the European Parliament. They were within their rights to stop the entire plenary session. They completely ignored the rules, and that's what is happening here. It is a trade treaty. It is not an agreement. It is not a partnership. It is a treaty. It is an economic agreement between one or more nations, just as if it were a peace agreement. Those are called treaties. They require 67 votes in the Senate. They're taking that away. It will only require 51 votes in the Senate. Now they're saying we're going to vote on it in the House as well. So don't you feel better that they are changing the Constitution without amending it? I don't feel better. And quite frankly, it was done that way because the Senate has the power to do a filibuster. Individual members can do a filibuster to stop a treaty. They want to make it difficult for these things to happen. Not easy. They're ignoring the Constitution, and they're going to shut down filibusters. They're going to shut down the typical way that a bill makes its way through the Senate, through the House, going through committee, being recommended by the leadership. No, they will demand that these new treaties will come to the floor in no less than 45 days. They will have no more than 20 hours to debate it, but they will not be able to amend it. And as I pointed out, once this is passed, it can be amended and will be amended, just as we see regulations being constantly written by the EPA and other bureaucracies here in the United States. Now, although our elected representatives are not standing up to this, and we don't see the kind of outrage in America that we see in Europe, most of the public here in America doesn't even know what this is about. They don't even know what the TPP stands for. They don't even know. They've not even heard of it. Still, we have some people who are pushing back against the global agenda. We have farmers who are now starting to ditch GMO soybeans, and they're doing it because of economic interest. But of course, this is something that is going to be a part of these trade agreements. And understand, too, that it's not just the TPP, the TTIP. There's already been 2 more agreements that we've learned about in the 2 weeks since the Senate ran this through and came up with a fast-track authority that hasn't quite passed the House yet. There are going to be multiple trade agreements that Obama can bring through, that the next president can bring through, because it's going to last for 6 years if it passes the House. So you need to call these people up, tell them that you're aware of it, tell them that you're watching it, just as the people in Europe have done, and it has backed this off, at least for the time being. But here in America, we've got some farmers who are acting out of their own economic interest that are ditching GMO soybeans. As Christina Sarich of INFOWARS.com points out, if Roundup Ready variety of soybeans cost $65 to $70 a bag, but conventional non-GMO varieties are only $30 to $35 a bag, in other words, half the price, She says you would think that farmers would go with the non-GMO stuff. It costs half the price, and they can sell it at a premium because people are concerned about the health implications, not only of GMO, but also of pesticides and inorganic fertilizers. Now the University of Arkansas is planting 9 non-GMO soybeans on test plots. 4 of those strains were developed by the university. And she says, and here's why. Of course, we're told that they have to have the Roundup Ready GMO because that's going to keep the weeds down. Nevertheless, there are other weeds that it doesn't work on. And we see that the weeds themselves are modifying themselves in the old-fashioned way. Not in the laboratory, but just with selective breeding to become resistant to Roundup. She points out the resistance issue has really changed people's mindset in the agricultural business. There are 7 glyphosate-resistant weeds now, and other weeds that are resistant to other herbicides. That is always going to be the case. You're always going to have natural adaptations. The concern is that with monopolized food supply, if you have one strain of genetically modified variety, that strain could be lost and we could face a famine. Not just the fact that these corporations would own everything. And of course, that's the underlying motivation behind these trade agreements. Now, moving on to Bilderberg, of course, our reporters are there and the mainstream media is starting to talk about it a little bit. Here's a story from Yahoo. Never mind the G7 or Davos, it's Bilderberg time. Now, it looks like they might be understanding what's really going on here, but not really. Here's a quote from Yahoo. They say, critics deplore the fact that unlike last weekend's Group of 7 meeting in nearby Bavaria, no press are allowed at Bilderberg, giving rise to accusations of secrecy and suspicions of dishonest goings-on. But organizers say that since the gathering in Telfsbuken last year was in Denmark, they say, is away from prying eyes, it allows those attending to talk freely about hot-button issues of the day. Yeah, move along. There's nothing to see. Just the most powerful people on earth telling you that you can't talk to them, that you can't cover even who is there. Of course, they'll give us their official list, but we can't see who's going and coming there. Now, what kind of important issues would they be talking about? Well, of course, one of those is what's going on in the European Union itself. Greece is trying to come up with something for this Greek tragedy, and as the AP points out, Greece is getting a wake-up call next week, could seal its fate. Do you think they might be talking about that with some of the heads of the largest banks throughout the world, as well as the politicians there? They say the clear message that came out, swiftly tone down your demands in the bailout talks over the next week, or face financial ruin. Yeah, these guys are playing hardball, these bankers who are there. And of course, one of the bankers who's there is Mario Monti. Remember him? Goldman Sachs. He was appointed to be the technocrat in charge of Italy when they were in financial straits. Evidently, the Greeks are not willing to take some Goldman Sachs banker and give him the reins to their government. So it looks like they're going to play pretty hardball with him. They say the IMF took the toughest stance, saying that it was bringing its negotiations back to Washington as there had been no sign of compromise. In other words, you haven't given us what we want, so we're going to take our ball back to Washington. That's some of the types of things that are going to be discussed there at Bilderberg. But of course, Charlie Skelton, who is there along with our reporters, and he's from The Guardian, he was on the air today with Alex Jones talking about what happened to him. He had a very interesting perspective because he was at the G7. And he said this in today's article at The Guardian. He says, at the G7, we journalists were pampered, but at Bilderberg, we're harassed by the police. He said Bilderberg uses the same security as G7, just on a slightly different mountain. So why don't the lavish state resources extend to allowing free press reporting? And then he gives a personal recount of what happened. He says, back at the G7 summit, barely a day and 20 miles from here, I was treated like a prince. I was one of the chosen 3,000 journalists who were primped, pampered, fed, burped, given free t-shirts, gallons of goulash, buckets of booze, and all the cheesy footage of world leaders we could swallow. We lay back on our branded beanbags and were tickled silly by the gentle fist of the G7 PR machine. But not anymore. The beanbag has burst. And then he quotes these these Austrian police who come out, step out of the vehicle, show me identification papers. A group of Austrian police officers took up position around my car. I pulled on the handbrake, opened the door, and I swear one young officer shifted his hand to the butt of his sidearm like I was about to rush them, all 12 of them, all of them armed. And of course, that's exactly what Josh Owens told us as well. When they got pulled over, the guys are putting their hand on their gun as if they're ready to pull